Thank you to Sydney Southeast Asia Centre for having me. I did kind of get like a red-eye flight into Sydney a couple of days ago and didn't actually manage to sleep on the plane. So when I wrote this speech, it was after 36 hours of no sleep. So it's either delirious or hilarious. I don't know yet, but we'll see. Okay. So how many people here already know Singapore fairly well? Yeah, that's okay. That's pretty good. What comes to mind to most people when we think about Singapore, right? So usually it's like this. It's a small country. It's so overachieving that we can't just have normal trees. We must have super trees. Or we're like a city-state that we need to like be the best in everything, right? So we can't just be financially prudent Asians. We need to be crazy rich. But for like. And this is a sort of PR campaign that the Singapore government is very heavily invested in, right? The Singapore Tourism Board gives money to so many things, including promoting this film to kind of project that Singapore PR image, right? Unfortunately, they gave out a lot of money to a lot of people, but they forgot to give me any. So I'm talking about a very slightly different Singapore today. So I'd like to talk today about a specific piece of legislation that's new to Singapore, that's really kind of like kicked off freedom of expression when it's down. And so this piece of legislation is called the Protection from Online Falsehoods and Manipulation Act. It's a very Singapore thing to make the legislation sound as administrative as possible, so it sounds like it's really about efficiency and protection. We're going to protect the population from online falsehoods and manipulation. Because we're very kind of acronym obsessed as well. In Singapore, everybody just calls this POFMA. So misinformation is not a new problem to any country or any society, but we have Donald Trump to thank for gifting us with this very annoying new buzzword called fake news. And it's the way Trump tells it, there's fake news everywhere. But astoundingly, coincidence, the only places fake news can be found is when the coverage makes him look bad. And because we really are very good at like picking up buzzwords and running with it, and not always very good at like critically thinking about what they mean. The term has caught fire and it's kind of gone around the world. It's been adopted by journalists, it's been adopted by governments. You'll hear about fake news in Malaysia, in Philippines, in Europe, and so Singapore is no exception, and POFMA is supposed to be our response to the scourge of fake news. So when the government talks about POFMA, they actually talk about POFMA as a piece of legislation that protects freedom of speech in Singapore, because they're like, we're protecting society from fake news, so it's better for free speech. But before I go into like what is in POFMA, I thought I'd just give a bit of background about Singapore for people who might not know it very well, or might not at least know this side of it very well. So this is the logo of the ruling party in Singapore. Singapore is proof that lightning can strike in the same place more than once. In fact, you can say that Singapore has been struck by lightning every 5 years or so since 1959. Because that was when the PAP came to power and they've never left, right? So that I emphasize this because I think it's something that's often overlooked, but people really need to keep in mind that if you think about it, they came into power in 1959, so no Singaporean aged 60 or below has any memory of a country that hasn't repeatedly been zapped by what I call the electric bolts of the PA Pikachu. And so you really need to kind of remember that there is a psychological factor to this, that no Singaporean 60 years old and below can even remember a different political reality. So there's no memory in Singapore of a time when a different party was in power, a different government. And so I think this is really very crucial because it's the psychological element that runs underneath a lot of things, that in Singapore the power of political imagination has been very, very heavily restricted and limited, so that the boundaries that we think may or may not actually be there, mentally have ossified into actual walls for a lot of Singaporeans. There are some things that people just don't want to talk about. So 2 years ago, when Reuters Institute in Oxford did a study, they found that over 60%, probably around 62 or 63% of Singaporeans said that they worry about what they post online because they're afraid of repercussions when they post political content online. And so this is a culture of a lot of self-censorship. So it's not overt censorship from the state that you can see, but there's a lot of internal policing going on, where your friends and family police you, where you will get parents call up and say, oh, I saw what you posted on Facebook, you shouldn't have said that, maybe you should take it down. Or you have friends who say that, or you self-censor. So it's a big common problem. But it's not just about Singapore being a one-party state, it's also a place where freedom of expression and freedom of assembly has been under threat for some time. So I thought just share some recent examples. So this, for example, is a photo of an illegal assembly in Singapore. It's a panel discussion. So I was speaking in this panel with another Singaporean, and then my friend Jolavan, who is an activist in Singapore, had organized it. And you can see on the screen that Joshua Wong, who is a pro-democracy activist in Hong Kong, had Skyped in. So we were talking about activism and civil disobedience in a democracy. And so he didn't come to Singapore in person. He said he'd just Skype in because it was easier. The authority said that because Joshua Wong is a foreigner and not a Singaporean, there should have been a permit for this event. And because there was no permit for this event, it is an illegal assembly. And so Jolavan, the guy with the mic in the photo, has been charged and convicted, found guilty of organizing an illegal assembly. And he's currently appealing the charge. I think they wanted him to pay a fine, but he's appealing it at the moment. And he says that if he loses appeal, he probably wouldn't pay the fine, he'd rather go to prison. Jolavan is the most famous, as the police call it, recalcitrant in Singapore at the moment. So he has also been charged with organizing another illegal assembly, which is an 8-person silent protest on a subway train to raise awareness of the historic use of detention without trial in Singapore. He's also charged with vandalism for pasting those 2 A4 sheets of paper onto the train. So they said that's vandalism. So he has not yet been on trial for that. And then we have an illegal procession. This is a photo of an illegal procession. The number of participants in the procession was exactly 1. This is Silang Haleh. He's a performance artist. And he ultimately served 2 weeks in prison for this because he went and stood outside. He was carrying a mirror as part of a performance art piece, and he walked from a park to Parliament House, and then he stood outside Parliament by himself with the mirror, and then the police came to arrest him, and they said that it was an illegal procession. So I didn't write any jokes or funny bits in this bit because I thought they kind of wrote themselves to see this is how we define an illegal procession in Singapore. But other than that, we have this long list of broadly worded laws that curb civil liberties, with which POFMA will fit in very nicely. I do recommend that you read this book if you're interested in understanding how Singapore uses the law to police the society. So it's a rule by law rather than a rule of law. It's a really interesting read because she breaks down some of the legislation that we have. So what does POFMA do? So POFMA is a law that covers a huge amount of ground, and at its crux what it does is it allows government ministers, any government minister, to issue orders to correct, remove or block access to online content, even if that content was originally posted overseas. So as long as there is one end user in Singapore who can see it, it's covered by POFMA. And so even if you wanted to appeal the minister's order to the High Court, the law is written in a way that you would first have to comply with the order, then go to the High Court to get them to overturn the order. So failure to comply could result in fines or jail time. And essentially it allows ministers to become the arbiters of truth because they just issue executive orders that you have to comply with. All that's needed for them to issue the direction would be for the piece of online content to be considered a false statement of fact, and for the minister to believe that's in the public interest to take action. And if you look at this slide, false statement of fact in the Act is defined as a statement is false if it is false or misleading. And that's kind of it, right? So that it's not very helpful. Public interest is also defined on a lot of grounds, and the one that has caused the most worry is the last one, because it says it's also in the public interest to act to prevent loss of public confidence in government institutions. So that's incredibly broad. And these powers can be transferred to appointed alternatives during an election period. So a minister can appoint an alternate and then he goes to campaign as a political candidate. This is our law minister. He's our law and home affairs minister actually, so he's an all-round powerful guy. So he says that this law, he was really advocating for this law, and he says that it's an exercise of government power to set out the truth. But I would rebut with this very big scary photo of him with photos of some social justice kittens. And the discussion in Singapore then became, what is truth? Who gets to define what is truth? There were a lot of academics who were very upset. There are some academics here today who had signed the petitions as well, who were very upset about how this really kind of tries to take over, allows the state to define what is truth and what is opinion. And that would really harm academic research and academic inquiry, because a lot of that is about challenging established wisdom. So there was a lot of pushback. Activists, academics, journalists, tech companies, human rights groups all kicked up a fuss. The government had to go into this big defensive mode to convince people that it wasn't really that bad a law. But because of our political reality in Singapore, because the ruling party does have the super majority of seats in parliament, this law did end up passing on the 8th of May. And so it's the law of the land now. It's not yet enforced because they haven't written the subsidiary legislation. And efforts to get amendments to the bill just didn't work. So the bill passed completely. And now it's a question in Singapore civil society of what do we do now? We couldn't stop the bill. So the bill is coming, but what do we do about it? And so one of the things that came out of it is that the academics who had resisted set up this called academia.sg, and it's a site that will continue to monitor and also wants to expand it to talk about academic freedom in Singapore, because that's a big problem that nobody has been talking about. Academics have been known to lose tenure, lose their jobs, be blacklisted from institutions, kicked out of the country, and nobody talks about it because it's very difficult to find a paper trail, to find proof. It's always this whispered conversations about you being blacklisted, but you can't come out publicly, because if you come out publicly and they say, where's the proof, you don't have any. And so this is something, a new initiative that some academics have done to try to raise this issue, try to monitor the issue a little bit better. And of course there are concerns that, POFMA will turn out to be a very, very bad idea, because a law this broad with so few checks and balances could end up breeding distrust in society rather than trust, because people feel like the government is hiding something from them rather than protecting them from fake news. And so there's an ongoing fear that not only is the law counterproductive, it would actually be a bit of an act of self-harm for Singapore. And so talking about what to do now, there's a lot of wait and see in Singapore, because people don't really know what they can do since the law is not really enforced. There's a lot of, we have to wait and see how it's going to be used. Nobody knows how it's going to be used. The sense is that the law will be kept and used selectively in a targeted fashion against other people. So if anybody wants to do a sort of sweepstakes to see which activist is going to get it first, there's quite a lot of interest in Singapore to gamble on this. My name is in the pot, and so is Jollivan's. I think Jollivan might be winning the sweepstakes at the moment. And so there's a lot of challenge for civil society to keep up the momentum, because it's really difficult to keep up public interest and momentum in something that hasn't actually happened yet, and something that's legislation, and it's very wordy, and it's 80 pages of legal text. And so it's really hard to kind of keep up the momentum so that there will continue to be interest and resources to monitor the use of the law, to analyze the use of the law. So academia.sg is a good way to do it, but they're going to need a lot more help. And I would just like to end to say that also there is even more legislation on the way. So according to the government, POFMA is one of a trilogy of new laws. So apart from this, they also want to introduce laws on combating hate speech. How hate speech is going to be defined is not yet known. And combating foreign interference. and how foreign interference is to be defined is not yet known. So for example, New Narrative, the platform I run, is essentially not allowed to legally operate in Singapore because they said we took Open Society Foundation grants and therefore we are being used by foreigners to meddle in domestic politics, even though I am a Singaporean. So it is a bit of a worry for us how they define what foreign interference is and who is going to bear the brunt of this law. I somehow don't feel like it's going to be big foreign organizations that bear the brunt of this law. I think a lot of Singaporean activists will end up bearing the brunt of this law, so we don't know what it's going to be yet, and that's something to look out for, because really the devil is in the details, and so there will need to be very long, sustained vigilance, which is why I come and speak to as many groups as possible, because we need help to kind of keep eyes on this, because most people's idea is still about the super trees and the crazy rich Asians, right? We need awareness internationally about this. And so I don't want to take up too much more time, but this is the end. And because I come from New Narrative, and because we are a small, as Kian said, we are a small independent media publication, I was told by my team that I had to end on coupon codes because they're like Southeast Asians like discounts. So they said I had to end on this slide because there's a coupon code at the bottom that gives you $10 off joining New Narrative. And so they even made sure that like the coupon code font was bigger than my email address. But my email address is there if anybody needs to find out more about Singapore, if you want to. So I run New Narrative, which covers Southeast Asia, but I specialize in Singapore. So if anybody has any questions, if you want to write for New Narrative, if you want to know more about Singapore, that's how you can contact me.